Hi, welcome to the first episode of Queer Questions. My name is Felix Fern, my pronouns are he, they, and I am one of the co-founders of Trans Activism UK, as well as a speaker, writer, and all sorts of other things that keep me busy. Thank you so much for tuning into this first episode. This episode is with Toby, who is an ex-gender critical, or TERF as he has described it before, and this interview is about his experiences. I would like to warn you that there are mentions of self-harm and mental health within this episode, as well as, unsurprisingly, the topics of transphobia and issues surrounding the gender critical movement, as well as cults. So if you're not in a place mentally to handle that right now, that's absolutely fine. Please go and take care of yourself first and foremost. With that out of the way, let's listen to the episode. This is the first interview that I'm conducting for Queer Questions, which is a new podcast series that I'm doing with various members of the LGBTQ plus community, primarily focusing on trans POVs. So my pronouns are he, they as well, FYI. Could you let me know your name, pronouns, and a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Toby, and my pronouns are he, him, and I've got a very long, complicated past. But at the moment, well, there isn't really anything much else exciting aside from my exciting story, I suppose. Um, I spent a number of years out as a trans man, from when I was about 16 to 18. And then I detransitioned in early 2019 and fell into uh, turf stuff. And
Yeah.
turf stuff, that's what we'll call it. And I'm now what I'd call back as myself, and I feel the most sane I have in a very long time. So
That's
that's
very
always good.
good
That's
to
always
hear. That's definitely good. So I first came across you on my Twitter feed with a thread that you made in November about how in 2019 you had given a talk at Women's Place as a detransitioner and as a TERF. But you are now 2 months post-op, or it's probably getting closer to 3 months
It's
post-op
actually,
stage,
I
I'm
think
assuming.
it's, yeah, 12 weeks is 3 months, isn't it? So that's
Yeah,
next week. Next week.
amazing.
Not
And
that I'm counting.
and that hopefully soon that you'll start testosterone as well. Um,
Yes.
so for anyone that doesn't know, Women's Place is a rather notorious gender critical organization. They specifically campaign for women's separate spaces, which means that they specifically want to exclude trans women, and they are all around quite a known transphobic hate group. But I want to go take a step back a little bit. So on the 29th of November, you tweeted saying that the reason you stopped your transition is that you weren't getting the help and support you need as a trans person. So what was that process like for you? How did you realize that you were trans and then find that you didn't have the means to deal with that situation properly?
Yeah. Um, so when I was about 14, I realized I was quite different to my peers. I mean, I knew that all along, but it became really obvious, and I stuck out like a sore thumb and got picked on a lot. So I started asking questions about myself about then, and that's when I made my first Tumblr account. So I had a Tumblr account called Asexuality Team Blog, which it wasn't a massive following, but at the time, I think I had about 100 plus followers or something. So it was my little corner of the internet where I felt safe to ask questions and discover things. And because I'd had a couple of boyfriends at that time that I didn't feel anything for, I thought I was asexual, which is where it all started.
Mm.
Um, and given the environment I was in at that point, I was school was getting worse, and I just sort of felt more and more isolated. So I went more and more into my little bubble. Um, and from that, I then gender questions came up naturally because I was in the space and also I was having those questions. And I posted something about saying I don't like traditionally feminine things. Could I be non-binary, basically?
Mm.
Um, and somebody said, "Well, if you feel it, you are." And that's something I twisted quite badly in when I was a TERF. Um, but I was the one asking the questions and I was the one doing it, so nobody was forcing me to do anything. Um, but then I very quickly sort of backed away from that because it felt too big and scary, and I didn't really know what all of it meant. Um, and I didn't revisit it probably until the beginning of 2016, maybe late 2015 at that point, a few months, maybe 6. Not that that's that important. And so in early 2016 is when I first realized that I was a trans man, and I very quickly didn't really know how to deal with it. I was in a situation at the time where it was nothing LGBT was really talked about, and I didn't really understand me, and I was a very quiet kid, so anything that sort of drew attention to me, just it was all just a very mixed emotion time, a very confusing time. And so I came out quite quickly because I needed to get it out of my head, basically. I've always been somebody that talks and needs to talk, and I'm just a very open book, sometimes too open, but it's just how I am. So I ended up coming out in April 2016 to my parents. I'd come out to a few people previously and sort of had, you know, mixed emotions, but it wasn't anybody too close, so they weren't really going to have feelings about it. And I came out by letter because I was too terrified to say anything. So I left a letter for my parents and went out to school and then came back and just sort of dealt with it then. And I admit that partly probably because it was a letter and it was a bit informal, impersonal, sorry. Uh, they didn't respond too well initially, and it all sort of just blew up from there. I hold nothing against my parents, obviously. I mean, I understand now as an adult what they were thinking, and there was lack of information at the time. Um, but yeah, it all sort of blew up, and I was not even dealing with it in my own head. So to be dealing with it with other people's feelings and the responses, there was a lot of arguing and a lot of fighting. And so I was in cams at the time as well. I think that might have happened. That did happen, I think, after I came out, but it all sort of happened around the same time. And I started self-harming not long after because I needed a way to cope with all that was going on. I mean, there was other family things as well, you know, general life stuff, other stuff, and then this on top of it. It was a lot to be handling at that point. So I needed a release, and that's where I fell into that. And so then from CAMS, I got a referral to GIDS in Leeds, and went there in 20. I think it was beginning of 2017. So I just turned 17 when I went there, so I was on the edge of the age bracket.
Yeah.
So we went for one meeting where we sort of sat in a circle and talked about stuff, which they called the first meeting, but it wasn't really because you weren't really uh, given anything. It was just let's sit in a talk in a circle, sort of here's some basic information, right? First appointment done, goodbye. Um, and my mum said as well, with me and my mum have talked a lot about this, and she said that wasn't very helpful at the time. She thought there would be more support for her as well.
Mm.
Um, that's on the parental side as well. And so I think I had another 2 appointments there. The second one, I remember sitting in a room and I was wearing a hoodie that said, um, gender, people think gender looks like this, and it had a male and female, and then it was crossed out, and then it said, and then it had like a spectrum of colourful people at the bottom. It was very obviously what I was saying, and I wore this to the appointment, and I remember her saying, "So what does that mean?" Or like, why? It was basic. I've never had so many. I don't mean to read too much into what people are saying, but you know when you can just tell when somebody's looking at you like, why on earth have you done that?
Yeah.
And we had a very awkward conversation about that, and my mum picked up on it as well because she was in the appointment at the time. And it was just from the beginning, I had a lot of judgment about the way I was being trans, or being myself. Or I mean, at the time, I was still trying to figure it all out anyway, so I was very loosely just sort of doing whatever I was trying to do. But there was always a lot of judgment, or I felt a lot of judgment from those in the healthcare side of things on how I was doing things and the way I was looking. Um, and my last appointment there, we ended up having to, I get not, I wouldn't say get into a fight, but we had to fight them to write a referral for me to get to Nottingham Gender Clinic, because they didn't really want to. I can't remember specifically, but there was a bit of resistance to it, and not necessarily because I didn't have the things that met the criteria. It's just I I don't really know what was going on. It was just a very poor lack of communication, and it just sort of felt like you were trying to run up a slippy uphill or something. It was just very confusing, and but I did get the referral, and after my dad had a few words and got me my referral, and that got sent off, and then I had my first appointment in January 2018. So it was quite all of this was quite quick, which is one thing I will say was the positive. If I'd had more, if things had been better or more supportive, or if they'd been more useful, the quickness was definitely one of the good things.
Mm.
I don't believe I wasn't ever rushed into anything. Obviously, I'm not saying that. It was very good that I got in when I did, because had it been better, the service been better, I was in the right place, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. Um, and perfect storm, I guess, because I got from CAMS and then I went to GIDS and then I went to Leeds. So I could have been waiting a lot longer than a year or so to get into Nottingham. As we
Mm.
know, the waiting lists are
Yeah.
many, many years long. So I was just turned 18 when I went to Nottingham Gender Clinic, and I had my first appointment. And at that point, I was still identifying as a binary trans man, and I was still wanting hormones at that point, or thought I did. I always knew that top surgery is the thing I wanted 100%. I've not really questioned that. I mean, obviously, there's active and inactive thoughts, but the reason that I wanted that has always existed. And I knew at some point in my life I was probably going to end up having it done. Um, so I changed my mind. So I had that appointment, sorry, and then it was a pretty routine appointment. It was just getting your basic details and stuff. And then between that and the next appointment, I think it was like 4 or 5 months, something like that. And in that time, I'd come out as non-binary, and I had a lot of backlash, both from the trans community and outside of the
Mm.
trans community. At that time, non-binary was very, I'm not saying it's any much better now, but I mean, it was very sort of underground. You're not really trans, the whole trans enough thing, trans medicalism, that whole kind of.
Yeah.
I got down that road very quickly. So I spent a lot of 2018 trying to fight for myself in that sense of saying, well, I am valid, which is why I got my valid tattoo. And it was just a lot of trying to prove myself to other people. And I see now that I probably should have been, well, obviously I should have been more focusing on myself, but I was trying to just get somebody to hear me, or somebody to see me, and get where I needed to be. So I had a few more appointments in Nottingham, and they were ended up being basically along the same lines, because I told them I was non-binary and I didn't want hormones before I'd had top surgery.
Mm.
Um, I did not. I was at the time I was saying I definitely didn't. I was pretty sure I didn't want hormones, but I knew that I couldn't make that decision until I'd had top surgery,
Mm.
because it made sense to me to do the thing I was sure about before I did the thing that I was unsure about.
Yeah.
And sorry, just to jump a little bit, stretch a little bit here. Um, if I'd gone on hormones at that point and never said that I didn't, to get to top surgery, because that's how the process works.
Mm.
Um, I think I could. I mean, obviously this is hypothetical, but I think I could have been one of the detransitioners who had medically transitioned and then regretted it and become that way
Mm.
inclined, because I'd have done something that wasn't right for me, either at that point or generally, however you want to look at it. I was doing something because I thought I had to do it to be trans
Mm.
or to be good enough or to get to the next stage that I wanted. And I think there wasn't enough self agency over my own transition. It was just kind of, you need to do these things, and
Yeah.
everybody told me I wasn't trans enough. So I had several appointments basically just sitting in there, asked the same 3 questions over and over. So I'd wait months between appointments to have the same questions asked. Um, and I learned to lie about my self-harm because I think by 2018 I'd actually stopped anyway, but there were times when I had to lie about it because I knew
Mm.
that I wouldn't get taken seriously or get where I need to be because they view me as unstable. And I'm not saying I was stable, but a big reason why I wasn't unstable was because of the lack of support and because of the situation, not because that was wrong for me. And so I left in late 2018 after I just couldn't take it anymore because it was too bad. And I've just rambled on for a very long time.
No, it's all really interesting background information. Do you mind if I ask how old you are?
Yeah, I'm 23 now.
See, I find that interesting because I'm 34,
Mm,
and I can relate to a lot of what you're saying from how things were back when I first started transitioning. So I kind of, because of that, I would have assumed you were older. So it's interesting and also kind of saddening how
mm,
similar some experiences still are. Because I remember back when I first started transition, I came out very early. Literally, I was 13. And then I
wow.
like came out again and again, like every year until I
Yeah,
started transition at 17. And things were very similar back then, where non-binary wasn't really a term that people used. Genderqueer or genderfuck were very more common. Non It was quite a few years before non-binary became the more common term, and there was a lot of transmedicalism. But again, people didn't call it transmedicalism then. That was
yeah.
just being trans. If you were non-binary, you probably weren't trans enough, and you were kind of othered.
Transgender and transgender and
Oh God,
not really trans. Yeah, that's a whole different thing we can get into.
that's a horrible
Yeah,
realm.
that's that was an interesting time. I mean, yeah, I think things change, but also, I mean, I think there's been more of a change now. I mean, I don't want to say on it too much because obviously I've been out of the circle for a while, so to speak. But I have definitely noticed a change around that, and I think that's really good because
Yeah.
yeah, having to deep dive on the internet to find things and then have the people who are supposed to be with you again. Yeah, it's just a silly argument, really, and I think a lot of it comes. Well, I'm probably speaking for a specific group. I think some of it comes from privilege, doesn't it? It comes
Mm.
from this idea of, well, I'm more trans than you, or I've got access to the medical transition and you haven't, or I want to medically transition and you don't, therefore I'm better than you. It's this whole I'm better than you and you're down there kind of thing, or
Yeah,
it's very toxic and it's
it
not
is.
helping anybody. It's an inner argument within an argument, isn't it?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think the things how are getting and are a lot better than they used to be. And you're right, a lot of it is tied with privilege. So, for example, gender fluidity is often subconsciously more associated with not being white, and a lot of binary trans movements are focused on popular white people. So there is a
Yeah,
lot of kind of, if you have more money and you're white and you're a bit more privileged, you're going to be popular if you go through a very kind of cookie cutter transition where anyone else is othered. And that's a lot of the time, those people are also often more marginalized,
yeah,
um, which is another ridiculous conversation. Um, but yeah, it's, as I say, it's very interesting, that I know a lot of people will understand your perspective from, unfortunately, there are bad experiences within the trans community. It doesn't mean that the trans community itself is negative or
exactly.
bad or a bad influence or lacking in support, but in every group there are going to be struggles, and I think a lot of people will be able to relate to that. So how is it that you ended up getting caught into organizations like Women's Place?
Yeah, so when I left the gender clinic in early 2019, I actually rang, well, just a little bit of backstory to the backstory. I rang them up and decided that it's a bit crazy now thinking about it, but I understand why it happened. Um, I'd sort of, my head was exploding with everything that was going on. It was all just too much. I knew that I'd let I thought I'd let people down. I wasn't what people wanted me to be. I wasn't what, it was just so much. There was a great big avalanche coming for me. And then on top of that, I realized that I might want children.
Mm.
Um, it was a very small might, but it just sort of sent me down an avalanche. So I rang them up and I said that I'm going to go and have a child, and I went back to being a woman. Basically, it's probably the most unhinged thing I did if I think about it at that time, because how on earth at 19, barely 19, I was going to plan and do that, I don't know, but I just needed a way out. Saying need is the wrong thing, really, because I didn't consciously want a way out of being trans, but everything in me just couldn't cope with it anymore. So there needed to be a way out, and the only well, there was that road, which ended up obviously the child bit went away, but that road that I went down, I'll go in a second, but or the other road which was a pretty dark road, which probably would have been that I wouldn't have survived much longer, to be honest. So I ended up going back to being a woman, as I put it at the time, and I went on the internet because that's where all of this started, and that's where, you know, and that's where the internet has its information, doesn't it? And I don't mean to bash the internet. I think the internet is one of the greatest things that's happened if you think about it. I'm not saying there's obviously horrible things that happen on the internet, and there are things that shouldn't be on there, etc. But the fact that people have access to information on a very broad spectrum is actually pretty helpful, when used correctly. And
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
yeah, it's one of the yeah. And so there's a lot of things that have got really good in them, and they're also going to have the bad side, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's nothing's one way or the other. Um, so I was on there, and I don't really know how I came across it, to be honest with you, but I think I started getting more in the way. I was very angry, if I think about it. I was hurt, I was angry, I wasn't okay, and with that, I didn't really know who to blame or what to blame or how I should actually feel, etc. And I think a lot of this was sort of bubbling up under me. So I ended up finding out about a meeting that was happening in Newcastle, and it was at the Irish Centre, I think it was, and that was in May, no, June. Sorry, June. I detransitioned in May, and that was in June. So it's probably no more than 3 weeks after I had this sort of collapse of everything. And I went to this meeting, and I'll be honest, I was quite naive. I think I'd started to have issues with what I would call issues with trans stuff, because obviously I needed somebody to blame, and I was probably just going to blame or say I wasn't trans. And but I was very naive to what it actually was. I wasn't going in there thinking there's a load of transphobic people in here. I was just sort of going to this meeting to meet women because I thought, well, I'm a woman, so I should speak to women.
Mm.
And I've also spent a lot of my time online, so I thought, well, maybe I should go in person because that's what you do, isn't it?
Mm.
It's, internet bad, people good. So, um, as people would say. So I went to this meeting and I ended up sitting down. Just, I mean, things happen. Perfectly bad timing, I guess. Perfect storm, but bad outcome. I sat down next to Maria McLaughlin,
Mhm.
and she was the person who was attacked in Speaker's Corner. I
Yeah.
don't know if have you heard of her? Yeah.
I'm
She's got
sadly
a lot.
aware of Maria. Yeah, she is also aware of me. Yeah.
Oh, okay. She's aware of me too, and she'll be very aware of me. But hey, it's fine. Um, so I just happened to sit next to her. Had no idea who she was,
Mm.
and at this time, I don't think she was very. I mean, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure she was quite low down. She wasn't that as bad as she is now.
Mm.
The best way to put it is she's pretty bad now. Um, yeah. So yeah, it went crazy. But anyway, I sat next to her, and I will admit I was wearing a woman, adult, human, female t-shirt. But again, it sounds really silly now, but I was just stupidly naive to what all of that meant. I was just
Mhm.
looking at it on the sort of like the top layer of, well, I'm a woman, so I'm a woman adult,
Yeah.
and well, these people are advocating for women, and this trans stuff has hurt me, so therefore, it was a very sort of thin layer across the top, I guess. And so I sat next to her and I got talking, and I don't remember how it got up, but I just started talking about what I'd been through.
Mm.
And I think I was on a table maybe of about 10 people, 10, 15 people. It's quite a big table of people. And so I started talking to her, and then other people started getting involved. By about halfway through when the panels had started, oh, and Michelle Moore was at this meeting as well. So she was why there was trans people protesting outside, which I
Mm.
understand now. And so about halfway through these people talking on this panel, nobody's watching the panel. They're all just wanting to talk to me. And so literally nobody knew what was going on these panels. They were just talking to me, and I was like, okay, this is interesting. I never had this much attention in my life. As I say,
Yeah.
I was a kid in the class that everybody even made fun of, or I just got ignored, and I learned to zone out and just block people out. So I think, admittedly, part of me did enjoy this attention
Mm.
because, well, obviously somebody's listening to me,
Mm.
and I'm getting heard, and I don't at that point, nobody was sort of feeding me anything, but they were sort of talking to me, and I'm sure the things came up that I maybe said that started to, make me think. Um, and by the end of this meeting, they were all asking for my contact details because
Mm.
obviously they were asking if I was on social media and details. And I remember writing down my email address for people and stuff like that. And when I say people, I mean women specifically because obviously they were all women in this TERF meeting. And so yeah, and then Michelle Moore came up to me at the very end of the meeting. Now I don't really know exactly how it got from the table to her, but it did. And she came over and she sort of stood next to me and she said, "Do you want to come up and talk on the panel?" And I was like, "What? What?" And bear in mind, I've never done any at that point. I'd never done any public speaking. I never did anything like that. So obviously, and I was very fragile at the time, so I said no. So I didn't even know what I would have said if I was going to go up there. And oh, and my name was still Percy at the time as well because I hadn't changed my name back. So I was sort of at that sort of middle point between still being sort of in the literally slap bang in the middle.
Mm.
And then from that, when I left, I had a lot of people. I can't remember if anybody actually emailed me or not, but I did have a few people contact me on Facebook and stuff.
Yeah.
And so I made my Twitter account, which was originally Percy JD Trans, which I completely forgot that it was because it became TJD Trans. And I just made this little post about I can't remember exactly what I put in it, but a brief outline of my story. I'll admit I haven't watched a lot of my stuff back or read it because it'll just make me upset or angry, and I can't deal with it, to be honest. And I don't see the need in torturing myself.
Mm.
um, but I do remember it was basically an outline of a story. It was pretty tame in terms of views. And then those few people from the group started liking it, interacting with it, and then obviously other people. And once Michelle had shared it, and I think Maria might have been on Twitter at that point, but once those few bigger names had shared it, obviously it went a little bit mad.
Yeah.
And then I wrote a proper article for Medium, which was quite long, and it was a bit more. It was definitely a lot more turfy, and that was when it all sort of really kicked off, and I got followed by a lot of people, and it was quite intense at that point. And then I remember I got involved with Leeds Resistors, and I went to a meeting with them, and they ended up being some of my friends in Leeds, which is where I used to go to a non-binary group in Leeds as well. So kind of made sense. And I got involved with them, and they thought I was an infiltrator imposter. At first, they were worried that I was working from the other side, and which is kind of ironic now because they probably actually think that. It was my plan all along. No, it wasn't. I kind of wish it was though, and I wish I
That'd
knew what
be
I'd done.
very
But anyway,
smart.
yeah, just without all the pain and problems I caused. Yeah. Um, so I met up with them, and I sort of started speaking to them, and then I started doing a few actions with them. Now, obviously, I don't remember. I'll be honest, I don't remember the specific way that this all happened. I just know that it sort of slightly it was a little snowball, and it just started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I went to the first one, which was Sheffield, which ended up being a disaster because it was chucking it down, and we ended up waiting in the wrong place, which is hilarious now thinking about it. We went to the wrong gate because they changed it so that we wouldn't be there.
Mm.
And I was there with my little sign because it was very small at that point. A4. Wow. And then when we went to Leeds, which makes sense, and that was when it got bigger. And I remember there was the parade and they all stopped, and the group that I used to be friends with, used to go to, and a lot of them were in it and they were all shouting at me. And obviously some of them could see who I was.
Mm.
I've spoken to a couple of them since on message. I wasn't expecting anything. I just sort of wanted to say, hey, well, look, I'm not doing that anymore recently. And so they all stopped and they did that, and I was holding my banner, and that's when it really got kicked off on Twitter, obviously, because at this point I was pretty well known. And I started with my slogan, which was "Stop Transing Lesbians," and I sort of got a slogan and started doing stuff. I sort of became a mouthpiece for this, and then I got lots of news requests, all sorts of requests, and I got asked to speak at Women's Place. Now, I don't remember when or who contacted me about it, to be honest, but I just remember I said yes because it was my first chance to publicly talk. So I said yes, why not? I didn't really know anything about Women's Place before that point. I don't think I'd ever really seen or heard them, and might have just occasionally passed it on Twitter. I'm not saying that I was completely unaware of anything I was doing, but a lot of these things I got involved with, I was on that very top there, and I didn't really understand the underneath
Mm.
bit. Um, so and it was all coming from a place of my pain. It wasn't really I wasn't intending to be a horrible person, even though I became very much so. Um, so yeah, I went to do that talk in Leeds in November and 2019, and I was planning for ages to write a speech, but never did. I just sort of did it and hoped that something would come out of my mouth that made sense, which we can argue now would or would not make sense. Um, and then I got a lot of attention after that as well because they were all really happy with me. I remember going to the pub afterwards and everybody wanted to talk to me.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because um, when people give me praise when I was doing my turfy stuff, it sort of felt like a well done, you said the right thing kind of bit.
Mm.
And I'm not saying that, I know this is actually one of your questions, wasn't it? I know I'm not, they were genuinely caring. I'm not saying it was like, well done, you did our job good in robotic
Mm.
voicing, but it was sort of more about what I'd done and about what I was doing. Whereas when I've had the recent stuff on Twitter, when I've retransitioned and they've sort of gone, you do know you're being love bombed by the trans community. It's like, well, I'm not being, and they were like, this is horrendous or something. I can't remember who it was. Somebody said something about it being horrendous. And I'm just sort of like, I'm not being funny, but how can you read messages from people being really nice after what I've done? How can you read that as a horrible thing? I mean, it just makes me realize, sort of sitting on this side, how toxic it all really is, and
Yeah.
it's sort of covered up with the oh, we're just women advocating for women's rights, and then yeah, it gets very messy underneath. I mean, that's the obvious statement, but yeah.
Whilst you were caught up in kind of the middle of this and working alongside, or maybe not working, but talking with women's group and or women's place rather, and other groups and people who you'd interacted with through that meeting, the kind of attention and support you were getting from them, was that making you happy and kind of helping cover up the kind of lack of support you were feeling before and the unhappiness you'd had when you stopped transition? Or was there kind of a subconscious knowledge that you were still trans that was impacting how you felt?
I think when I detransitioned, because it happened all so quickly, I don't think I ever processed. I've tried to figure out how to word this multiple times, but I don't think I ever had chance to process my transition or detransition through a sort of neutral lens.
Mm.
It was always to use the word again, it was shoved down that turfy lens. It was so I don't I've tried to figure out how to phrase that exactly because obviously I would have been able to, I probably would have still detransitioned when I did
Mm.
because something had to happen because I couldn't cope.
Mm.
But I sort of the way I that's it, it got formed into a narrative and into a way of viewing things, and a lot of things that I have processed recently and view very differently now, or sort of even neutral, or just sort of, well, that's what happened, got processed to say, well, that's a bad thing, or that's horrible, or why did that happen, or you shouldn't have felt that. And I mean, definitely now understanding that the attention I got was what I was lacking from the support that the well lack of support that I'd had before. I was getting heard the first time. I was getting
Mm,
seen, and I could do something about the issue. It wasn't what I thought. Well, it wasn't what needed to be done technically, but I was doing something about it. I wouldn't say at the time I was saying I was curing myself, but I believed it had gone away
mm,
because I went from being really, really dysphoric all the time and really uncomfortable and having to fight for myself, both name and pronouns and whatever, to just being a woman
mm,
and just sort of walking into a space where it was like, well, you're a woman and you've got no choice about being a woman. And I think that was part of it because I had no choice or thought I had no choice. It was I didn't need to fight it in my head. It
mm,
wasn't like I need to figure this out or I'm gonna have to advocate for myself. It was just sort of a known fact.
mm.
Obviously, it's not technically, but at the time, it was just a fact, an accepted fact, and I didn't have to do all this work I'd done. So their support, I thought was supporting me because I sort of thought I'd gone back to my real self, I guess,
Yeah.
and they helped build that up. And I think even though I was my birth name again eventually, and even though I was a woman, and even though I was probably what people in my life would want me to be, I don't talk too much about my family because I'm not willing to bash my family or say anything horrible about. I mean, I don't. We're fine, and that's where I'll just leave it. But it's hard to not bring it up a little bit because it's kind of a big thing that happened.
Yeah.
Um, but there were people in my life who didn't like me being trans, and it's the best way I could put it. And there were people in my life that became turfy as well when I did.
Mm.
So, and I've had somebody I love very much say to me that he thought he won the lottery when I came back and detransitioned.
Ooh.
So I was a lot, yeah. That's a whole other thing. As I say, I feel like I can't talk about them in it, which it makes it very difficult. And I know I don't need to share everything with the world. I get that. It's just I've got nowhere aside from my own head to really think about that stuff. And sometimes I just
Mm.
need to. I don't like talking about something without being able to talk about the other bit, but I know where my boundaries are now, and that's
Good.
something.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have boundaries before. Um, but and so there was a lot of that of knowing that I was more acceptable as a woman, knowing that I thought I had more value as a woman, and it was just a lot less painful, at least on the surface.
Mm.
And it gave me a way to, and I don't really know how it happened, but I just sort of started blocking out all my feelings, especially about my chest dysphoria, which has always been my worst.
Mm.
Um, and I think I just became, when TERFs say that trans people are not being their true selves, they're trying to be something that they're not.
Mm.
That's exactly what I was doing when I was being a woman.
Mm.
um, I created an avatar, a character, somebody that I was that was acceptable and liked,
Mm.
and somebody that meant that I could survive. It was a cover. It was a protection of my real self, I guess. And so when that person was accepted and liked, that sort of just drilled it into my head or something that it was real because people are like, I don't know, it was a very it was a thing at the time that I didn't really understand or even think about. It just sort of happened. But now looking at it from the other side in a different angle and a more neutral way, I sort of can see how it all happened now and why it was almost very comforting
Mm.
to not only get attention, but also to get liked for who I was, supposedly.
Yeah.
Um, and also the women, I mean, obviously, as you know, a lot of turf people, women, uh, what terms should I use today? Um, are older women.
Mm.
So with going into these spaces as what I thought was a young woman who was confused and a lesbian and all of that, I thought that older women would know the answers and that
Yeah.
these were people to look up to. And I was just, I mean, I was only 19 when I went into the spaces, and most of them were in their 40s plus,
Mm.
some of them in the 70s. It just sort of, and now we were talking about older feminism and stuff. It just seemed to me that I'd walked out of this space where it was all full of, and I'm not saying this in a negative light now, but it was just a view, full of younger people, some older people who were all using different words and different names and having to advocate and fight for ourselves. And all of this where I could just walk into a space where everybody was the same and it was just a fact that you were biologically whatever you were and that was it. And I think it was just this very black and white view, and it's a lot easier to just put yourself in a little box and stay in that box and not really think outside of it.
Yeah.
It's comforting in a really messed up way, and when until you sort of take a step out of that box, you can't really see what you're looking at. It just makes sense, I guess, at the time. And, I got quite a lot of friends from that time, and we used to meet up, and one of them even recently apparently won a TERF-tastic award or something, or TERF of the Year. It's all a bit messed up in that group. Um, but yeah, so I just sort of I slotted in, I guess, and looking at it now, I called trans, uh, as I call it at the time, trans ideology, which is obviously not a thing. Um, there are trans people, but there is not trans ideology. Um, but looking at it now, if we're going to call anything a cult, and I'm not, part of me felt scared about throwing around the word cult because I've done that before. But if we are going to call anything a cult, people being themselves and doing what they want with their bodies and their own existence and just trying to exist and live, that is not a cult. And one basic human rights, that's not a cult. How can that possibly be a cult when everybody's slightly different and everybody's got scope to move within that? When you move into a space where it's full of women who are all advocating for either the eradication or of rights or people and believes that they've got it right, etc., and go around campaigning against all that. I think I know which one's probably more likely a cult if we're going to call one a cult, and that's definitely not trans people. That's that's TERF ideology. We'll call it that.
Well, I mean, you've segued wonderfully onto my next topic.
Have I?
I mean, so before I move on to that, I just want to say that your experiences, I think, from how you've described them, do make complete sense. This is kind of how I come onto the topic of discussing the idea of cult-like behavior, in that you were someone who was very isolated and feeling very vulnerable because you'd had such negative experiences. And even if people don't mean to and there is no malicious intent behind it, being in that position makes you very vulnerable to people who prey on that kind of situation. So it makes, I think it's very understandable, though it may not be ideal and it may not change actions that you've had. It's very understandable that you fell into something where you were given love and support and attention and recognition and acknowledgement of your experiences. I think we can judge very harshly when people fall into situations like that, but there's a reason why it's people in vulnerable situations who end up like that. It's not people who are happy and confident and well
Yeah,
adjusted, because if you were like that, you probably wouldn't benefit as much from that kind of attention. So yeah, I do think it makes complete sense that you ended up
yeah.
in that situation.
Yeah, it's somebody that can be shaped and molded into what they need
Yeah.
rather than, I mean, say if I look back, I can sort of think, well, I should have done this differently. I could have done, I'm not going down that road. It's just sometimes you look at these things, and if I'd waited till I was more secure in myself a little bit before I came out, I maybe would have had, and I'd come out in a way where I was more assured in I mean, I was never assured in myself. That's the well, not
Mm.
problem's probably a bit, but it is a problem. I was never ever sure in my identity at all, not at any point in my transition or detransition. I was always very confused. I mean, I don't like the word confused because I knew what I was running from. I knew what I was doing. It's just I was confused in the sense of I didn't know how to deal with it and what to do and what that meant for me, and therefore it just sort of led me down some interesting roads. But yeah, it's sort of it's a way that if you've got somebody who's very naive to something, you can shape and mold them. If I'd gone in being very sure in my views, then there wouldn't have been anything to do really. I'd have just, I don't know, it'd have been interesting, but yeah, I sort of walked in blindly and yeah,
I think
that didn't.
I think there is a lot of expectation from the trans community for everyone to be incredibly sure of themselves and know exactly what they
Yeah,
want. And that's how you know that you're trans, because you want this and that, and you've got dysphoria, so you'll fix that thing you're dysphoric about. And the reality of it is that people are not that confident and that sure of themselves. And that's natural in all things in life. If you throw in this incredibly rare minority experience that is being transgender, I think it would be mad for everyone to be 100% confident. Some people
oh
claim they
yeah,
are, and that's amazing for them, but I do think that's rare. I think that's something I think the NHS fails with, particularly with kind of like we were discussing before, their very cookie cutter process of
yeah,
transitioning. So in the UK, like you were saying, if you want surgery before hormones, they're like, well, why would you want to do that? That's not the way that we do things over here. And I think that's very counterproductive, and you're going to prevent people from being happy if you stop them from having bodily autonomy over how their transition should be. So I think it's silly, and it's something I think the transphobic people use against us a lot. Is the idea that we should be very sure about everything. That's not
yeah.
natural. That's not natural at
No,
all. It's very normal to have nuance.
it's logical as well, isn't it? Because if you have doubts and questions, then you're being logical. You're not blindly walking into something. To be scared of transition is a completely logical thing,
Absolutely.
and to be scared of being trans, I mean, I'm scared of being trans is probably the wrong way of putting it, but oh, I'm scared. No, but and I still deal with it now. I spent a very long time trying to convince myself that I'm not, or I can't possibly be because of X, Y, and Z, or that I haven't done that, or I can't remember being this when I was 3 years old, or
Yeah.
that there's this whole sort of thing that goes around your head, and it's sort of part of me thinks, well, I can't possibly be trans, or that there's too many, there's too many people, it's these kind of like little eating thoughts in your head, and it's kind of I'm just trying to be at a place now where I'm not doing it to be trans. I'm not doing anything I'm doing to be trans. I'm doing what I'm doing to be me, and that just happens that I am trans. I'm not trying to become something or become a create a night yeah, as you said, like the cookie cutter version or something. It's just I'm taking it a step at a time. Admittedly, it's all happening quite fast at the minute, but when I step back and look at it and go, wait, hold on, this isn't fast. I've been dealing with this. I would say 8 years probably, because I mean, is that 8 years from 14? I think it is, isn't it? I don't know. It's been a long time, and just because it's not all been happening over this sort of like traditional pathway doesn't mean it's not been happening.
Yeah.
And I sort of have to sort of calm myself back down sometimes and think, well, right, I mean, it's sort of a very whatever, but I sat on a panel with detransition women who were talking about how they felt like they were butchered and that hormones are horrible and that surgery's awful and whatever. Let's just sort of say, well, if I've been able to sit there and listen to that and then still want those things or need those things, then I think that says more about me than it does about the situation. I mean, I'm not saying that I believe those things anymore. I don't believe anybody obviously who's had surgery is butchered or mutilated, and there's obviously an argument of poor medical care and bad surgeons and stuff like that. That's more what we should be arguing about, not are people butchered or not. And I don't think viewing anybody as butchered is a helpful. I don't think it's healthy to view yourself as butchered.
Yeah.
Um, regardless of what your feelings are about that decision you made
Mm.
6 months ago, 2 years ago, so it doesn't matter. I think it's a very unhealthy way, and I think that's what, well, that's what gender critical people play on. It's that whole kind of, well, you're doing something that I don't. They don't understand why you're going through a transition. You're not doing it to become something or to attack anybody or to get into spaces or to do these things. It's something you have to do because you want to survive. It's not. I'm not doing it for the fun of it. I didn't just wake up one morning and go, you know what? I just really want to do I don't really want to make my life way more complicated. It'd be much more fun. Let me just hop on that plane and I'll go to Istanbul and just get parts chopped off. That'll be fun.
As you do.
Yeah, just a normal afternoon activity, isn't it? You just do it. But even my own brain, because I mean, as well, because I was in those spaces for so long, I had these issues before, these doubts. I've got videos of when I was about 16, talking about how much doubt I had and how upset I was and how stressed I was because I just sort of didn't really know where to. It's sort of like trying to pin something down, like an anchor, when you're in this whole sea of chaos. There was no anchor. I mean, even something small as in, well, I know that this is right for me, and then putting that down. But I was letting other people influence me because I didn't understand. Um, so that's what I'm trying to do now. I'm just trying to sort of stay, well, this is me and this is what I'm doing, and I'll figure out the rest later.
Yeah.
It's kind of, I'm just taking it as one part at a time. So I wanted to change my name, so I changed my name, and I've wanted to say want. I use the word wanted very loosely. I know I needed it, but obviously has to be a want there because you have to want to go through it. Because yeah, um, so I've just put things in place, and I think after I had that breakdown in April when everything sort of went very badly. Um, I sort of didn't turn up to work. I had a lot of work stress. This is what I mean by things being kind of unrelated and not really knowing what's coming your way. I think one thing can be covered by a lot of stuff. And I'd spent years piling and piling stuff on top of this just to try and get rid of it. And I became a workaholic at one point. Oh, there was also the year where I became super ridiculously religious. That also happened. And so I just got really involved in work because I was needed. And again, it was that
Mm.
kind of, the shop was in crisis basically, and there was only me and my manager to run it. So I sort of people who know me probably would argue that this is not true, but in a practical sense, if there's a crisis, I can deal with it.
Mm.
So I've applied myself to that job. I worked because there was something I could do.
Yeah.
Me turning up to that shop every day and me running that shop on very little training and whatever was had results. I could see that I was doing something, and I was pushing on through, I guess. And then once that thing collapses, I have to face something that I don't want to face. So either something
Yeah.
else has taken in that place, or now what's happened is that when I got to this breakdown, there was nothing left. There wasn't religion, there wasn't uh going out and doing turf stuff, and that's what lockdown happened because I wasn't going out and doing my activism,
Mm.
and I wasn't in those spaces anymore. So there's one good thing about lockdown, I suppose, even though I did get religious, but you know. Um so once I got more and more space away from these things and sort of run the end of the line, like with religion, I went into it head. I mean, I'm a researcher. I just go into things
Mm.
deep dive anyway. I always ask questions. I mean, I remember being really young and thinking about things way more than I should do, and it's just how I am. And so I remember getting to the end of this and just realizing it was silly. Basically, it's
Mm.
like, well, I got into Bible version issues and God knows what. It was just I got to the end of it and I couldn't do it anymore, so I got rid of it. And that sort of same thing happened with not gender critical ideology. God, I really have to get my words right. I have to think about these things. So when I had that breakdown, it sort of jump started that disconnect. I mean, it had already sort of been happening over that period of time between 2019 and early 21 because I'd not been involved in the spaces as much, but my actual views of trans stuff and everything like that haven't really changed. So I had that breakdown in April where I didn't turn up to work because I decided to go out. Well, not decided, but I went out the night before and got really drunk in the street, which is something I've never done before. And I just sort of was at breaking point, but I was still in denial about it because a lot of my issues are that I don't believe things are real or don't know how to connect to my actual feelings. It's like this great big brick wall in the middle,
Yeah.
um, with the word denial written across it. And so I did that, and then I didn't go to work the next day, which is to say something I never do. I mean, when I was at school, I was self harming all the time. I couldn't cope. I had nobody left, but I still dragged myself into school every day because I can't not turn up to school. That's something you don't do. Um, I just sort of it's this perfect image of just trying to get to be what everybody needs you to be in a situation.
Yeah.
And I just broke and I couldn't do it anymore. And I spent several months, I fell back into self-harm and I was drinking a lot to cope and all the things that you shouldn't be doing basically. And I had several months off work because I just couldn't cope with it anymore. And at the end of this sort of period, I mean, it's obviously hard to pinpoint an exact end point, but around the sort of couple of months mark, I just sort of had I don't even remember when it happened, but I had the realization that I still needed top surgery.
Mm.
And that's where it sort of started. It wasn't like, oh, I'm trans.
Yeah.
It was just about top surgery at that point.
Yeah.
So I was still, I was slowly, it's sort of like a slow dripping tap, slowly started to move away from my views. But I realized I wanted top surgery. And at the time, I justified it to myself by saying it would make me feel more like a woman.
Mm.
Um, or that but that's something I've come to understand now that regardless of whatever gender I identify as, it's not about the identity that's making me want the surgery. It's about the dysphoria of my chest that was making me want the surgery. And I can be any gender that I wanted to, and I could still have top surgery.
Yeah.
So that isn't like oh, well, I have to be a trans man to have top surgery. So I think this has been quite interesting in deconstructing these ideas around trans stuff as well,
Mm.
and about the views of my transition. But yeah, I remember saying that and talking about it like that at the time. And I booked it at the end of July for September because, nice and quick. And I just sort of I guess I just sort of took hold of the situation and just did something about it.
Yeah.
And that's something I can do quite well. I can just sort of deal with the situation. I say it can be good and it can be bad. So I just thought, right, I need to do this, so I'll just do it. And I booked it for September and I took out a loan because I didn't want to ask. I was almost going to raise money, but then I thought, well, I can't ask people for money. Oh, hi, I'm sorry, I was doing these really horrible things, but can you pay for this, please? I just didn't feel right doing that. Um, and to be honest with you, I don't mean to sound whatever because people are like, well, you can wait and stuff, but I did need to do it
Yeah.
now. It had to happen. So I just took out a loan. There was one place that offered me a loan, and I was like, yay, that's good. And so yeah, and then I think by the time I went to have the surgery, I was trans again. It sort of happened between July and September, but I don't remember specifically how it went from point A to B. It just sort of slowly happened, and then sort of to cut a long story short, really. But once I realised I was trans, I sort of thought, well, I can't really. The views I had don't really make sense
Mm.
because I'll be obviously going against myself. So one was sort of next to the other, and eventually both of them just sort of broke. And I remember one of the things was I was like, "Oh, I agree with this, and this, but I don't agree with trans kids. That's wrong, isn't it?" And then I had the realization. I was like, "Wait, hold on a minute. Why?"
Yeah.
um, and recently I've sort of thought about it, and I'm like, "Oh, yeah, hold on a minute. I technically was a trans kid." And it's just reframing a lot of stuff for a different lens, and little bits and pieces sort of come up now and then. I've had to fight against a lot of stuff in my own head. I remember when I came out of work, that was terrifying. And I'm sort of in a situation now that I never wanted to be in before. When I was 16, I wanted to transition. Obviously, I didn't couldn't access it at that point, but I wanted to transition before I moved out so
Mm.
that I would start a whole life and just sort of have
Yeah.
it done. So, you just nobody knows and you just sort of go on and exist. And I never understood why people transition when they were older.
Mm.
Like I saw a lot of people transitioning in sort of mid late 20s and beyond, and I never really understood why. I thought, well, you know, if I've got it right here, right now, I need to do it right now. And obviously, then I had the very difficult thing where I couldn't get through it anyway.
Mm.
And here I am now at 23 doing what I thought never would happen. It's interesting. But even though it's all been messy and everything, I do believe that now is the right time, technically. And I do say that even if I had medically transitioned at sort of 18, 19, or whatever had happened, I think at some point I would have had to detransition.
Yeah.
Um, in some way or form, I think it would have happened. because at that point, this was another recent thing that came up. I realize now that me choosing to do that was what saved my life at that point.
Mm.
It was a protection from what was going on. It's just unfortunate that I fell down the other way, because
Yeah.
in that time I could have used that detransition period to just focus on me and what I was doing. But I mean, I did learn a lot from it anyway. I mean, I learned that it's an obvious statement again, but I did learn that I could be a woman and look masculine, and I
Mm.
tried that. In 2020, when I went to be super religious, I became an ex-gay as well, an ex-lesbian. So I became quite feminine. Well, feminine by my standard, which I've never been able to do it very well. And so I've done a lot of that figuring out thing, and I'm glad I've had that opportunity to do it. It's just obviously I wish it didn't have to be through the lens that it was.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, there's and I don't want to. When I first started my Twitter account, I didn't want to sound like. I mean, obviously, I apologize because I'll keep apologizing because I know that I understand now the damage that what I was doing was causing. But I am also equally grateful that I had that opportunity to figure myself out. It's just,
Yeah.
I guess, both things can be true technically. It's just, yeah, it's not ideal, but it's okay.
It's that nuance thing again, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
like it's okay to stop transitioning. It's okay to question
yeah,
transition and to take different paths. It's just a shame that sometimes makes people vulnerable to more unpleasant
yeah.
situations. So you hit upon the C word earlier before I could, but I will take full responsibility for that term being used, which is the term cult in this,
Mhm.
because that is very much my proposition in this. So I will take full responsibility for this even being a discussion, and not something that should be pushed onto you. I want to make that clear. So I was doing a little bit of digging because I've had a lot of thoughts around this topic. And earlier this year, Insider published an article on the 4 signs that you're in a cult. The professionals they cited, like Dr. Steve Hassan, aren't free from controversy or bigoted views. He is not someone I would personally endorse in topics outside of things like what makes a cult. But I found that these 4 things that you listed were quite good summaries of typical cult red flags. So I wanted to read them to you one at a time and ask how you feel about them as to whether or not you think that they are signs that are present within the gender critical movement from your experiences and the way they treat newcomers. So, number 1 is the person is in an especially vulnerable state. Do you think that they can pick up on when someone is vulnerable and impressionable? Do you think that they target people like that?
Definitely, yes. I mean, my experience would say that's definitely true. I won't quote specifics, but I know there's been a couple of people on Twitter that said that they've had similar experiences, and there was um gender critical people messaging them about stuff. I remember being like you see people and you'd sort of almost encourage it or something. And I had a lot actually that reminds I had a lot of parents message me of kids, trans kids, and I would end up sort of telling them to ignore it and it would go away kind of stuff. So you get somebody in an emotional situation and then tell them what they want to hear basically, or what they believe they need to hear, and it gives them a way out. Yes, so definitely very vulnerable in different aspects of who that might be.
So, number 2 is that the person becomes close to a charismatic figure who begins to have an influence over them. So we've heard from past ex-gender critical folks, they've often been persuaded by someone who's very charming and persuasive figures and known figures in the GC movement. Would you say that similar happened with you?
Yeah, there were quite a lot of bigger names that you would look up to and think. I mean, to say that they were a god would be a little bit extreme, probably, but along that kind of line of, wow, that's somebody speaking out the truth and look how great they are at what they're doing. I mean, Posey Parker, Kelly J was definitely somebody that I was initially very naive to what she was doing, but I would look up to what she was doing at the time.
Yeah.
And there's been a few other ones that I in the groups that I would start looking up to and look to for guidance, etc. So yeah, it's there's a hierarchy, isn't there? Yeah.
So number 3 is the person is involved in a group with principles that differ from the mainstream. This one references religious principles in this article specifically, but we know that cults don't always operate on a religious basis, but
Yeah.
sometimes just belief systems that are almost akin to religious beliefs. I
Yeah.
personally believe that gender critical beliefs are not mainstream. Would you agree? And do you think there's an appeal in that?
Yes. I definitely agree. I think there's some sort of that hidden knowledge
Mm.
aspect, and because I was involved in being religious very heavily for that year, I can see a lot of correlation between the two things. Obviously different angles and opinions, but religion and gender critical beliefs do have a very similar way of dealing with things. And yeah, there's definitely a correlation there.
So number four, the final one, is the person is not able to step away from the community even for a short period of time. Was that your experience? Did you feel you weren't able to step away? And when you did, how did you step away?
Yeah, so when I was bigger on Twitter in 2019, when it all sort of happened, I did slowly move away because of the religion stuff. And I remember posting about it and having quite a lot of them say that it was fine. But I think I'd already sort of fizzled out at that point a little bit anyway. I know that when I came back, because I tried to come back at one point, I wasn't really interesting anymore. Um, and I know that's a lot of things outside of cults as well, but latest thing that's interesting, isn't it? But I feel like it sort of they went to the new person or the next person, or
Mm,
somebody was saying something more extreme, little extra bit. But I know there was a lot of detransitioners speaking out that were newly speaking out around the time I was. Um, Quite a lot of the bigger names on Twitter now, and a lot of them have become a lot more extreme and a lot more radical, and I think are not okay. So I think you can definitely step away, but you're probably not going to come back to the same thing.
mm.
Um, but I don't think they would care that. I mean, I think if you did really step away, they wouldn't really mind. There would always be something else to sort of take over the next bit. This, yeah, the
So
replacement, I suppose.
yeah, so would you say rather than the sort of typical cult thing where it's hard to escape, would you say it's more that they'll happily let you go, but then you may find the kind of love they gave you before may not be there again if you come back because you're not quite as exciting anymore?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I did have the people I was quite a lot closer to who didn't really change in that sort of way, but I think as a general view, um, in terms of your own head changing those views and escaping that way, that's definitely a lot harder. And I don't think if I'd, even though I'm now out as trans and I have been for a few months, I can't think how long it is, um, well, way less than a year and definitely less than 6 months, I definitely still have those thoughts come into my head and the way of thinking, both from religion and from gender critical stuff. I still have things pop into my head and I still think about things in certain ways. And that does affect me now. So yeah, it's a belief system and it's a way that gets into your head and it can be very hard to undo those unless something changes, I guess, which in my case was realizing I was still trans. But it's an undoing process, definitely.
So given the sort of like four flags that I've listed, this is not something I expect you to give a committed answer to. This is more for my own personal interest because I'm interested in your perspective and your experiences. So, as I say, from my point of view, from all of the research I've done over the years, I consider certainly the more radical side of the gender critical movement to be very cult like. I would probably personally describe it as a cult, but I say that as someone very much from the outside. Is that a term that you would use for that movement?
Yeah, definitely. I know that there's a lot of people that I was friendly with who knew that at the other time that I was calling trans ideology as it was then the cult. But I think as well there's a lot of well, I mean, not projection, but the internal sort of blaming somebody else, saying, "Well, we're not the cult, they're the cult," kind of thing.
Mm.
Um, and pushing ideas and say doing the things that they're doing, they say that other another group's doing basically. So I think there's quite a lot of twisting of what's going on, and it can be quite hard to see that, especially from on the inside.
Yeah.
And also, I guess it can be a little bit hard to see from the outside as well. Because I mean, I'm talking about anybody outside of both trans and gender critical or any of it. I mean, if you just look at it on the surface, both of gender critical wouldn't look that harmful, really.
Mm.
If they were told of it as just, oh, we're just women campaigning for our rights as women,
Yeah.
and we just want women's spaces, etc. Like that kind of, I say, that very top layer that you're exposed to is very well. There's nothing wrong with that kind of thing. It's got many layers.
So, on your tweet about being an ex-TERF and now pursuing medical transition, I would say that from everything I'd seen, the overwhelming response was positive. But I did see that some people had doubts and felt that your actions have been harmful to our community and that might go beyond forgiveness. What is your response to replies like that?
Yeah, it's probably what I mostly expected, to be honest with you. When I first came back onto Twitter, I expected to get, not that I expected people to be horrible, but I expected it based on what I'd done. I wasn't expecting the overwhelmingly good response that I've had. Um, and which I'm very grateful for. And some of them did say I was begging for it or something like that. And I can't remember who said that or what said that, but I honestly never went onto Twitter looking for forgiveness or anything like that. I really didn't expect it. I'm very grateful that I was given it. But so those few comments that I got about that, say I was probably more expecting. A lot of them I did apologize to personally in a message or explain what happened, and most of them responded saying that it meant a lot and that it was okay. Obviously not okay what I did, but okay, and they appreciate the apology. There was a few, or maybe one, that kept commenting on my stuff, even though I'd apologized personally a few times. And again, I wasn't expecting anything back, but I just kept saying, look, I wasn't expecting you to do anything. I wasn't asking anything of you, and just kept going. So I sort of left that because there's nothing I can really do in that situation. I don't want to go down that road where I sound like I'm begging, because I'm not. You're completely entitled to feel however you do about what I did and what I am doing. But just though that I genuinely do regret what I did, and I see it now for what it is, and I'm going to try and do, obviously I can't undo it, but I'm going to try and redo it in the better way, I guess.
Yeah.
Redo, undo. I can't take back what I did, but or make it right completely, because some of those things I did are completely out there forever. There's nothing I can do to take that back. Everything that I can take back, I believe I have got rid of or deleted. There may be a few things that I've lost logins for. Oops. Um, but yeah, I'm definitely not where I was. I'm not the same person in that way, and I'm not coming into this trying to cause any harm or anything like that anymore. I'm mostly now sharing from an angle of just what's going on with me and my stuff in my own head, not anybody else's beliefs or stuff. Before I became a spokesperson for all the stuff, and even though it's genuine, it was all tainted with that lens of serving a purpose, which I still do fall into, I will admit. My brain still goes into that with Twitter because I feel like I've got to, I'm like that anyway. I feel like it's got to be good enough and it's got to say the point and everything like that. But that's just partly how I am and partly how I did Twitter before. But I'm trying to let go a bit of that and just share things that are a bit more casual, I guess, about
I think
stuff.
it's quite hard to avoid that with Twitter,
Yeah,
especially if anyone remotely pays attention. As soon as someone's paying attention to you, you go from like I had a sandwich today to whatever I tweet must be
yeah,
important because it's going to an audience.
yes. I had the sandwich today, but now it's political.
Yeah, everything's political on Twitter. Every
Yeah.
sandwich is political.
Yeah, there we go. That's a new tweet. I'll put out. But
Excellent.
yeah, it's just a responsibility, and I think I just want to make sure that I'm doing it right. Not right in the way of must tick boxes. I mean, doing it right as in doing it right, I guess. I don't know. I just want to put out stuff that's more positive and hopefully helps, but I'm not putting any pressure on it like I was before. Trying not to.
Yeah, it's good. So finally, I wanted to go backwards a bit and touch upon that feeling of not being supported that you went through. So we already know from statistics that one of the biggest reasons for detransition isn't regret, but because people feel they don't have enough support from their family, friends, community, etc., in order to transition. So I wanted to know what you think could have changed things for you, what kind of support you believe is integral to people being able to transition. So we've discussed how for you, it sounds like stopping and detransitioning would have been important to your mental health regardless, no matter what had happened. But so I think this question for you has now changed a little bit to be less what do you think could have changed that and more what support do you think that people in that position need to have?
Yeah, I think it's a big question,
Mm,
but it's one of them that I think you can give many answers to. And again, it obviously probably personally depends on people as well. But I think, generally speaking, I think the space to explore in a way that's non-judgmental,
mm,
um, and to figure stuff out, and space to be heard and listened to. I know that I didn't. I mean, as I say, it's partly subjective, but I know I didn't feel listened to when I went to these appointments that I waited months and months and months for.
mm,
Um, so I guess better education as well, because I think a lot of it comes back to that whole, you know, binary way to transition or the right way to transition. And there's a lot of pressure on people not only to do it right, but to also provide the right information. You know, when you go to these
mm.
appointments, you feel like you've got to give a certain answer or you've got to do a certain thing. And I don't think somebody's answer, obviously, there is things that would dictate whether transition is right or not, but I don't think somebody's answer of something they like or something they want to do or whatever, little things, I don't think that should ever influence your ability to transition medically or socially for that matter. Um, and there should be more leniency, free movement within this way of transition. Um, so there's not as much, because I feel like that's something I've processed and thought about, because I think there is so much pressure to go down that medical pathway, whether you do or do not want to, and to be trans, that even this whole argument of, well, you might not be really trans and you could regret it, so we need to gatekeep it like this, it doesn't prevent those things happening anyway. Because if somebody's going to regret something, that's going to happen anyway, regardless of, you could have been given all the information in the world and still want to transition, do transition, and then regret. You could have been given very little information and really thrive on transition. There's no really, it's not a, if we keep this tight enough, then nobody's going to regret it. There are always going to be people who regret or don't, regret's a bit of a big word, but you can regret parts of something, you can regret something you did, you could think that maybe I should have done this differently. I think there's always going to be that. Like we say, it's not going to just be I'm at point A and then in 3 years' time I'm going to transition perfectly, because it's never going to work like that. Um, so I think it should just be more individual based on the person, and there should be space to discuss things and to discuss doubts. I mean, I certainly, when I say if I watched those videos back when I was 16, I didn't know I could talk about doubt, because if I thought I talk about doubt, outside of my little YouTube bubble, which had about 5 subscribers, I thought if I talked about doubt, that meant I wasn't really trans.
Yeah.
And if I had doubts, then I couldn't really transition. So I had to keep those doubts in a box
Mm,
and pretend that they weren't there. And even when you come out to people, you've got to pretend that you're sure. I mean, I remember that my family said, well, you're confused, you're not sure. So I had to pretend that even though I was technically sure, I had to pretend that I had no doubts whatsoever or anything, because otherwise people don't take you seriously, and
yeah.
that shouldn't be a factor in it. There should be room to move freely, and if you even if you went all the way through, I mean, that's the thing I thought now. Even if because when I started this again, I thought, well, what if I go through this and then I do regret it and I end up as a detransitioner again? Well, one, if that did happen, I wouldn't be going back into those gender critical views. So I know that that's not going to happen. Um, if I did detransition again, I wouldn't blame anybody for my medical transition. I'm not going to sit there and shout at somebody and blame them or be angry at somebody. I would know why I've done it, which I think is another thing. I think there's that sort of ownership of why you've done something.
Yeah.
Um, and taking responsibility for that. I'm not saying that there isn't medical negligence and all that stuff, but if you've done something with informed knowledge and out of your own choices, then you have to live with that choice, whether you like the choice you made or not. Unfortunately, that's how life works, and that's how you keep moving forward, isn't it? So even if I did decide that in 2 years' time or whenever that I didn't want top surgery anymore, and oh my God, what have I done? I'm not going to view myself as mutilated or as broken or want to do anything. I'll just sort of deal with those feelings and say, well, look, I know why I did it at the time and it saved my life. Like I'm now looking at my detransition when I did in May 2019. That served a purpose at that point in my life. Therefore, that's a good thing. And it shouldn't be something that's taken away from other people because they might feel like that or whatever. It makes no logical sense to say, well, I feel a certain way about what I did, so therefore nobody else can access it. I mean, there are plenty of people who are perfectly happy. I mean, honestly, I can say that this is the best, top surgery is the best thing I've done for myself. And I don't believe that I would want to go and put them back on tomorrow if it, and even if I was bearing in mind, even with the whole gender thing, even if tomorrow I decided that I was a woman again, I'd still want top surgery and I'd still want a flat chest. So what would it change? It wouldn't change anything.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be a pain in the neck of having to change my name 3 times. No, I'm joking. Do you know how many times I've had to change passports? It's ridiculous. I had about 4 within about 3 years,
Oh God,
and I
it's
still need to go and get
expensive.
a new one. Yeah. So I'm putting that off a little bit just because my bank account is screaming at the minute.
Yeah, I don't
Uh,
blame you.
yeah, I'm in a lot of debt right now, but anyway, it's fine.
Oh, mood.
I'm
Top
not,
surgery mood.
yeah, but I say I also see that as a privilege
Mm.
because I'm not, it's a privilege to be in debt. No, but it really is because not everybody could do that. Like,
Mm.
I mean, I'm in a fortunate position. I've got a house. I've got the ability to do that. I've got a job. I've got a pass. I had a passport. I could go. You know, there are so many people that can't access those things or whatever it is. And I say, I do see that as a privilege. And the fact that I mean, part of me does feel guilty about that because part of me still thinks, well, gosh, I did all that stuff and I was all this and everything. And now look at me, I'm post-op surgery and I'm about to go and have hormones. Am I just greedy or horrible? But I'm not. I'm not letting that brain thought be entertained because
Good.
it's not about. I mean, the past is the past, in it. I've just got to try and get on with it, and just telling myself that I can't transition because I did bad things wouldn't really make sense, would it? And I mean, I have had my referral to Nottingham again, so that should be interesting.
Good.
But we are talking like 4 years before I even get there. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I might as well do something about it now if I can.
Mm.
Which is say it's the kind of irony of it that I was in the gender clinic and I had that opportunity and now I'm here waiting on the 4 year list. So there you go. There's my
There's your punishment.
yeah. But it's I mean I even felt guilty about it at the time, to be honest, when I got those referrals because I didn't think it would happen so quick and I know so many people don't. So it's happened how it's supposed to and I'm just sort of getting on with it now. But yeah, it's all just a bit crazy. My head's a bit spiraling at the minute because I'm like, whoa, this is all happening.
I can imagine. I think that's very common with transition as well. Sometimes,
Yeah.
even if it takes years, when you suddenly get something, it'll feel like it's come out of nowhere, and you're like, "Oh God, it's happening so fast!" It's like, but
Yeah, what's this?
I've been planning this for years. It's not this didn't come out of nowhere.
I think,
But you're still like, "Oh,
yeah, I think as well. It's partly that thing. I had it in my head that it would never happen.
yeah,
I told myself for a long time, both in different lenses, that it would never happen. When I was before I went to the gender clinic, I told myself it would never happen because it seemed so alien and so far away. I mean, I was six. I mean, no, I was 16. It was only 18, but still, it felt like such a far off concept. I remember watching trans guys on YouTube and being like, "Wow, look at that! It's like magical." And then, wow, and then when I was at the gender clinic, I thought I'd get there, and then I didn't get there,
Mm.
and then even when I had top surgery and I had my reveal, and afterwards I felt like I should still feel something that I didn't feel. I mean, I
Yeah.
felt happy. I mean, say my body feels like mine now. I mean, when I it feels connected to me. It feels like mine and it's
Mm.
right. But I didn't have that sort of reveal of, like, outpour of tears and crying on the floor, and
Yeah,
bouncing around off the walls. It was kind of just a bit of a sigh of relief and then, like, "Oh, well, now what?" It's I think there's a lot of pressure on the feelings about that as well, isn't there? But,
definitely.
when there's been such a big build up to something and then the thing actually happens, it's kinda like, "Oh, wait, what? What do
Yeah.
I do now?"
Yeah,
Um,
it's a very weird but surprisingly common experience.
yeah,
So I
and now I'm back to
yeah.
normal as well, so I'm back to regular normal-ish with my healing, so there's also that aspect to it now where I can enjoy the things that I wanted to pre-surgery, so it's all just a bit of a surreal feeling, and there's many aspects to it. Obviously, mostly positive, but there's still stuff.
I would definitely say so from I'm definitely biased from a point of view of someone who is non-binary and has had a bit of a weird transition over the decades. But I completely agree with you. I think that a, a really important element of support that people can have is just space to explore
Mhm.
and think about things. And it'd be nice if people were less pressured to put on one direct path. I think that would benefit a lot of people, trans and otherwise,
Yeah,
to give
in other
people the
aspects as well,
opportunity.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, gender nonconformity and gender fluidity is a very common thing, and it's a shame that people feel so pressured to be one thing or another. So I completely
Yeah.
agree with you. I think that's something that would benefit a lot of people. Obviously, I don't have the power of the masses to grant like widespread forgiveness, but from my personal point of view, when I read your thread originally, and that feeling has continued to now talking to you and learning more about your experiences and what you went through. Um, Personally, I think that you could have not spoken out to say that you went through this. You didn't have to say that you'd done something bad and now your life had changed. You could have done it quietly. You didn't have to mention it on social media. And personally, I think it's incredibly valuable that you did, because it's a point of view that we don't often get to see, and we don't get to see it transparently. Um, how people have experienced the other side of things. So I personally think that's an incredibly valuable thing. So I really appreciate you being able to speak about that and to give us the opportunity to learn more. Like, I could more cynically say it's, oh, we're learning about our enemy, but that's not it.
Yeah.
It's more realistically is we're learning about human experiences.
Yeah.
Because
It
at
can
the
happen
end,
to anyone.
yeah, at the end of the
That's
day,
with anything.
the gender critical movement, as much as I may dislike them, they are all humans going through
Yeah.
something, and it's very interesting to learn about what may lead people down a path like that. So I think that your insight is really useful for that. So I really appreciate you both tweeting about it and making other people aware of it, because when I saw your tweets, I have like a little group of activists that I liaise with, and I mentioned it to them, and I had people come back just being like, "Yeah, that person was really infamous at like meetings and was known and stuff." And I was like, "I
Really?
didn't know
Oh.
about that." So it
Oh
was
my god.
interesting. Yeah, it was interesting to hear from other trans people being like, "Yes, we know who this person is, so this is really
Mm.
interesting," and getting to talk to them and just be like, "I want to talk to them because I think that's super interesting. I'm going to talk to them," and I'm really glad that I have, because again, I think it's a really interesting insight. Um, I can imagine some people will not be so happy about you speaking openly about it. So I do hope that you practice the timeless tradition of hide replies and block,
Yes.
because people are not worth engaging with half the time if they're just going to be negative and not have good faith conversations, no matter what
Yeah.
side of the spectrum they're on. Bad faith
I've had,
conversations not helpful.
yeah, I've had people find me who I used to be friends
Mm.
with when I was in the, GC movement, which has been a little bit interesting. Some of them have said, "That didn't happen like that," and
Mm,
whatever. It's very interesting because the comments seemed very whatever, sort of neutral, just, "Oh, that
yeah.
didn't happen like that," or, "I hope you're okay," but I could tell that I knew that there would probably be more that they would want to say.
Mm.
But, they don't wanna make it look bad, so, yeah.
I mean, we know of enough people who have gone through the gender critical movement that experiences like yours are not outlandish. They don't sound untrue. Obviously, I can't vouch for everything you're saying. I also don't personally have a reason to not believe anything you're saying, but we know from other people that everything you said sounds accurate. It reflects other people's experiences.
Yeah.
So I think that anyone that is going to get angry about you speaking about it comes across like they have something to hide rather than they're angry because you're lying. Um, Again, you've not said anything to disparage anyone throughout this whole conversation. When you've been explaining your experiences, you've never once attacked anyone. You've never said that any of them did anything unpleasant to you. You've never said they did anything unpleasant to anyone. So I think you've been incredibly respectful in explaining your own experiences, because that's what you're able to speak about. That's where you have the most knowledge. So I don't think anyone can complain. If they do, it's definitely in bad faith.
Yeah.
As I say, I really appreciate you speaking about this. It's been incredibly interesting to hear about your experiences, and I'm really glad that you seem a lot happier now. And as someone whose life was absolutely saved by top surgery, I'm glad that you're getting to experience that. I think that's wonderful. Um, Fingers crossed there won't be any regret later along the line. I would be, from everything
Hopefully
you
not.
said, yeah, it
I
certainly
think we're
sounds like
pretty
that's not going to
okay.
be the case. Yeah. As you
Yeah.
say, transgender or not, sometimes there are just certain things you need to be able to do with your body to make yourself happier.
Yeah.
And that's awesome that you've gotten to have that now. And I believe you said from your tweets you're hoping to go on hormones at some point as well.
Yeah. Update on that. Apparently it should be in the post today.
Ooh.
So that's exciting. I'm a bit nervous about Royal Mail strikes and also being at work tomorrow. Like I don't want to miss it.
Yeah, it might be a while. There might be a little delay.
They did well they said it should be posted today and arrive tomorrow, so
I mean,
we'll see
most
if that.
most medical stuff is kind of bypassing the strikes, so fingers
Yeah,
crossed.
yeah.
Um,
I did have a Royal Mail delivery this morning, so that is hopeful that they do exist.
that's a
So
good start. Well, hopefully that will be a fun new journey for you to go on. Being on testosterone is interesting and at times hilarious. So it'll be interesting to
oh,
see
I
how
can't wait to deal with it in customer service. It'll be great.
Oh gosh, yeah, I don't envy you, but Twitter can be an absolute shit show, but also a wonderful place if you ever need to poke other trans people about experiences with HRT and whatnot. There's some wonderful
Yeah.
support out there, as I'm sure you know. So if people want to follow you on social media, is where can they find you on social media? Is there anything you'd like to plug or anything like that?
Well, my main place is Twitter,
Hmm.
which is Toby Pick, and I am on TikTok, but I've forgotten my handle.
Oh yeah, you are young,
Um,
so that makes sense.
yeah,
I'm
I
too old.
went on. I went on it once as a. This is how a lot of people start. It's the deep dark dive of TikTok. I went on it once as a bit of a to look at something somebody had posted or something like that, and now I'm just I'm deep dived into TikTok now. I even make TikToks now. It's a downhill slope once you're on this.
I'm
Um,
sorry to hear that.
yeah, I know. It's bad, isn't it? But yeah, I did post that on my Twitter at one point. So if you dig on my Twitter, it's on there somewhere. If you really wish to do that, don't fall into TikTok. You'll never escape.
That's awesome. I'll make sure that I tag your social media in posts and whatnot. And yeah, thank you so much for coming and speaking with me. It's been really wonderful. Thank you so much for listening to our first episode. I really hope that we can do more of these. If you'd like to support Queer Questions, please check out our Patreon. The link will be in the description. Paying for the Patreon essentially means that you are paying the interviewees. At the moment, I pay for them out of a combination of my pocket and the current patron subscribers. The more people who subscribe, the more interviews I can do, because I want to make sure that marginalised people are paid for their time and that they're not having to do this for free. I really want to thank my current patrons who have made this so much easier and really made this project feel like a celebration, which is Nikolai, Jesse, Ed, and Addy. Thank you so much for making this possible. Thank you, and I hope to see you all soon.